It was a low clicking noise, the kind the V-Horan made in their throat when something struck them as beneath serious consideration. Consul Screeth made it first, quietly, when the human delegation's name was called. Then the delegate beside him made it. Then the one behind. It spread through the upper tiers of the Grand Council chamber the way a small fire spreads through dry paper, quietly at first, and then all at once, until the entire room was filled with the clicking sound, and the humans sitting at the floor-level table could hear every single click without a translator, because some sounds do not need translation. Ambassador Nora Vass heard it. She was 53 years old, gray-haired, and had spent 19 years in interstellar diplomatic work, which meant she had spent 19 years being in rooms where she was not entirely welcome. She had developed over those years a very specific skill. She could hear exactly what a room thought of her and feel nothing about it in the moment, saving all of it for later, like a person who catches rain in a jar. She was catching rain now. Beside her sat her senior aide, a man named Davo Pell who was 31 and had joined her team 14 months ago from Earth's Trade Division. He had never been to a full Covenant session before. He was watching the upper tiers with an expression that had started the day as professional neutrality and was now something closer to a person trying very hard not to understand what they were understanding. On Nora's other side was a woman named Safi, her communications officer, who had her eyes on her data board and had not looked up once since the clicking started, which was its own kind of answer. The session had been called to review a proposal, not Earth's proposal, the Covenant's. Specifically, Consul Screeth's block had drafted what they were calling the Realignment Directive, a 12-page document that proposed restructuring humanity's access to Covenant trade lanes, communication infrastructure, and joint research programs. The restructuring involved humanity contributing more to each category while receiving less in return, on the grounds that Earth's probationary membership status meant they had not yet earned equal exchange terms. Screeth presented it with the energy of a man who expected no real opposition. He called humanity's contributions to date adequate but minor. He used the word minor 4 times in 11 minutes. He noted that Earth's colonies were numerous, but that numerous was not the same as valuable. He presented a graph comparing human economic output to that of 5 other species, a graph that had been carefully constructed to exclude the 6 economic categories where humanity ranked highest. Nora had seen the graph 3 weeks ago when an advance copy of the directive arrived, and she had taken it apart in about 40 minutes and put her findings in a document that she had not shared with anyone yet. She was still holding it. When Screeth finished, he invited responses from the floor. 3 species spoke in support of the directive. 2 asked procedural questions. 1, the Sorvan elder, said nothing but raised a single gray hand briefly before lowering it, a gesture that meant in Sorvan diplomatic tradition that she was reserving her position, which was not the same as agreement. Then the chair recognized the human delegation. Nora stood. She did not go to the speaking platform. She remained at the floor table, which was technically permitted, and which drew a small murmur from the upper tiers, because it was unusual and unusual things in council chambers always drew murmurs. She said she had a document she wanted to enter into the session record. She said it was a response to the economic analysis presented by Consul Screeth. She said she would summarize it briefly in the interest of everyone's time. Screeth made the clicking sound again. Several delegates joined him. Someone in the upper tier said something in Dravathi that the translator rendered as "let her try." Nora opened the document. She began with the graph. She showed, using the Covenant's own archived trade data, what the graph looked like when the excluded categories were included. The numbers changed substantially. She did not editorialize. She read the corrected figures in the same voice she would have used to read a weather report. Then she moved to the second section. It was a list of every Covenant infrastructure project in the outer systems that had been completed on schedule in the last 15 years. She noted the completion rate for projects with human teams, 91% on schedule. She noted the rate for projects without, 54%. She cited the sources, all Covenant sources, nothing from Earth's own records. The clicking had stopped somewhere in the first 2 minutes. Davo noticed. He looked up from the table very carefully, the way a person looks when they are trying not to be seen looking. The upper tiers were quiet, not silent in the way an empty room is silent. Silent in the way a room full of people is silent when everyone has simultaneously decided to stop talking. Nora reached the third section. It was the shortest. It was a single paragraph. It noted that the realignment directive, if passed, would result in the reallocation of 11 human specialist teams currently embedded in Covenant joint projects. It noted that 6 of those projects were currently in active phases, and that removing the teams mid-phase would, based on the completion rate data presented in the previous section, significantly alter the probability of on-time delivery. She did not say what would happen if they were not delivered on time. She did not need to. The projects were listed by name. Everyone in the chamber knew what they were. She closed the document. She said she would be happy to provide full copies to any delegation that wanted them. She said the Covenant Secretariat was welcome to the underlying data. She said Earth was very much looking forward to continued cooperation with all member species. Then she sat down. The chamber was quiet for 4 full seconds. In Covenant sessions, 4 seconds of unplanned silence was unusual enough that the secretary later noted it in his personal record of the event. Consul Screeth said that the data would need to be verified. Nora said that would be fine. She said they had brought everything. Screeth said the session would be recessed for review. The session was recessed. As the chamber began to move and fill with the noise of dozens of species resuming conversation, Davo leaned toward Nora and said quietly that he thought that had gone well. Nora was gathering her documents. She said it had not gone well. She said going well was not what today was for. She said today was for making sure that the next session and the one after would go differently. Davo asked what the difference was. Nora said, "Today they stopped laughing. That is all today needed to do." She picked up her case. Safi was already on her feet. The 3 of them walked out through the side corridor while behind them 43 species tried to remember the last time a floor-level table had made the upper tiers go quiet. Most of them could not. Nora knew it would be long before she left the chamber. Long recesses did not mean the opposition was studying the data carefully. They meant the opposition was looking for a way around the data, which was a different activity and required more time. She had expected 12 days. 9 was faster than she anticipated, which told her something about how uncomfortable the document had made certain delegations. She spent those 9 days on Vera Prime Station because leaving would have looked like uncertainty, and uncertainty was one thing she could not afford right now. She took a small suite of rooms in the station's mid-level residential block, nothing diplomatic, just transit accommodation available to any registered visitor. The walls were beige. The bed was narrow. She slept well in both. Davo spent the 9 days doing what he was best at, which was reading. He had pulled every public record of Covenant Council sessions going back 40 years, and was building a map of every moment a human delegation had raised a concern and been dismissed, every proposal that had been redirected to a subcommittee from which it never returned, every informal comment made by senior Covenant members about Earth that had been captured in session transcripts. He organized it not by date but by pattern. He was looking for the shape of the thing. On the 4th day, he found something he had not expected. He brought it to Nora in the small common area of their transit suite. Safi was there too, running a relay check on their communication systems, which she did every 3 days regardless of whether anything seemed wrong. Davo said that 15 years ago, when Earth first applied for full Covenant membership. A detailed support brief had been submitted to the Council by an external party. The brief argued in favor of humanity's inclusion on the grounds of demonstrated technical reliability, cross-species cooperation capacity, and what the brief called adaptive problem-solving under conditions of limited resource access. It was a thorough document, 22 pages, and it had been entered into the session record but never formally acknowledged or discussed. Nora asked who submitted it. Davo said that was the part he had not expected. The submission code traced to the UVN Administrative Archive, which was a filing system that most Covenant members had access to, but almost no one used because the UVN rarely put anything in it. Nora was quiet for a moment. She asked if the brief had been seen by the Council at the time. Davo said it had been received and logged. Whether it had been read was a different question, and one the records could not answer. Safi said without looking up from her relay check that a document logged, and not read, was not the same as a document that did not exist. Nora said, "No, it is not." She asked Davo to make 3 copies of the brief and to keep them somewhere separate from the main case files. He asked why 3. She said because 1 could be lost, 2 could be a coincidence, and 3 was a policy. On the 7th day, a message arrived through the Covenant's formal diplomatic channel addressed to the human delegation. It was from the Murine Collective's trade representative, a woman named Counselor Veth who had not spoken during the session, and whose expression during Nora's presentation had been the careful blankness of someone doing math in their head. The message asked if Ambassador Vass would be available for an informal conversation at a time of her convenience. Nora read the message twice. Then she read it a third time looking specifically at the word informal, which in Covenant diplomatic language had a precise meaning. Informal conversations were not recorded. They did not go in session transcripts. They could not be cited in formal proceedings. They were the space where positions shifted before anyone admitted in public that positions had shifted. She replied that she was available the following afternoon. The meeting took place in a small food hall on the station's commercial level, which was Counselor Veth's suggestion. The Murine ate during meetings as a cultural norm, and the choice of location was a signal that she wanted the conversation to feel relaxed. Nora ordered something she could not identify from the menu and ate it without comment, because not commenting on alien food was one of the first things she had learned 19 years ago. Veth said, without much preamble, that several members of the Covenant Trade Committee had reviewed Nora's document and found the completion rate data difficult to dispute. Nora said she was glad it was useful. Veth said that the realignment directive, as written, was going to face significant opposition when the session resumed. She said this not as a concession, but as information, the way one professional tells another something they both already know but that benefits from being said plainly. Nora said she appreciated the directness. Veth leaned forward slightly. She asked what humanity actually wanted. Not the formal membership language, not the treaty terms, but the actual thing underneath all of it. Nora thought about this for a moment. She said what humanity wanted was to stop being treated as a guest who might be asked to leave. She said humanity had built things in this galaxy that were still running, maintained things that would have failed without human hands, and understood things about the outer systems that no one else had bothered to learn because they assumed someone else would handle it. She said what humanity wanted was for that to be seen plainly, and without the layer of condescension that had been sitting on top of every interaction for 11 years. Veth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is a harder thing to vote on than treaty language." Nora said, "I know, but it is what will actually fix this." Veth picked up her food and ate for a while without speaking. Nora waited. Waiting was something she had become very good at. Finally, Veth said that she could not promise anything, but that she thought the conversation they had just had was worth having. Nora said she agreed. They parted outside the food hall with the kind of polite acknowledgement that, in covenant diplomatic custom, meant nothing formally, and in practical terms meant quite a lot. Davo was waiting in the corridor. He had hovered at a respectful distance during the meeting, watching the room and not the table. He fell into step beside Nora and said that the Sorvan elder had submitted a formal request to the session chair, asking that the recess be extended by 2 additional days for full data review. Nora said she wants more time to read. Davo said she has probably already read everything. She wants everyone else to catch up. Nora almost smiled. It was not quite a smile, but it was close enough that Davo noticed it and filed it away as a good sign, which in 14 months working beside her, he had learned to treat with appropriate weight. She said, 2 days, all right. She adjusted the document case under her arm and kept walking. Let them read. It was not a large mistake by the standards of things that are obviously wrong in the moment they happen. It was the kind of mistake that looks at the time like a reasonable decision made by a person who is confident and slightly irritated and has underestimated the person sitting across from him. These are often the most consequential kind. The session reconvened. Screeth had spent the recess preparing a counter-presentation. He had brought in the V. Horan Economic Bureau's chief analyst, a meticulous insectoid named Advisor Kren, who had built a response to Nora's completion rate data using a methodology that reweighted project complexity to account for what Kren called environmental difficulty factors. Under this methodology, projects in the outer systems were rated as less complex than inner system projects because the outer systems had fewer competing interests to navigate, which by coincidence made the human completion rate look less impressive and the overall V. Horan-led project rate look significantly better. It was a sophisticated piece of work. It had taken Kren and 3 assistants 9 days to produce. Nora had a copy of it before the session started. She had gotten it through Safi, who had a contact in the Covenant Administrative Office who had processed the filing. Safi had not asked for it specifically. The contact had sent it because he had worked adjacent to human teams on 2 separate projects over the years and had a personal opinion about the realignment directive that his professional role prevented him from stating publicly. Nora read the counter-presentation the night before the session, sitting in the beige room with the narrow bed. She read it completely. Then she went to sleep. In the chamber, Kren presented his analysis for 40 minutes. It was technically detailed. Most of the delegates could not follow all of it, but that was not the point. The point was that it existed, that it was formal and complex and had citations, and that it gave Screeth's block something to point to. The chamber received it with the polite attentiveness that Covenant sessions gave to anything that was complicated and hard to immediately evaluate. When Kren finished, Screeth rose and said that in light of the updated analysis, the realignment directive remained sound policy, and he moved to bring it to a vote. The session chair acknowledged the motion. Then Nora raised her hand. The chair recognized her. She stood and said that she would like to ask Advisor Kren a few questions about his methodology if the session permitted. The session permitted. Kren remained at the platform. The first question was about the definition of environmental difficulty. Kren explained it. Nora asked who had established the weighting scale for that definition. Kren said the V. Horan Economic Bureau. Nora asked if there was an independent validation of that scale. Kren said validation was ongoing. Nora asked what that meant in terms of timeline. Kren said he could not give a specific date. The second question was about a project listed in Kren's data as low complexity. The project was the Outer Mirova Relay expansion, completed 3 years ago. Nora noted that the expansion had involved navigating 17 different territorial agreements, 3 competing resource claims, and a mid-project redesign after a geological survey changed the planned anchor point. She asked Kren what complexity rating his methodology had assigned to it. Kren checked his files. He said, low moderate. Nora said that was interesting because the Covenant's own project archive classified the Morova expansion as one of the 12 most logistically complex infrastructure projects of the past decade. She said she had the archive entry if the chamber would like to hear it. She said the human team on that project had a file too, including the messages they sent to Covenant coordination during the mid-project redesign, explaining the problem and proposing 3 possible solutions within 48 hours. She said she could read those as well. Kren said that individual cases were not the appropriate level for evaluating a systemic methodology. Nora said she agreed completely, which was why she had brought 11 more examples. She read all 11. It took 26 minutes. Every example was a project from Kren's own data, reclassified as low or low-moderate complexity, with the Covenant's official project archive rating beside it and a brief factual summary of the specific challenges the human teams had navigated. She did not argue with Kren's methodology directly. She simply placed it next to reality, case by case, and let the distance between them speak. By the 6th example, the upper tiers were no longer making any sound at all. By the 9th, Counselor Veth of the Murine Collective had leaned forward in her seat and was writing something on her personal pad. By the 11th, Screeth's mandibles had stopped moving. He was watching Nora with an expression that Davo, from the floor table, identified as a person recalculating something and not liking the new number. Nora closed her file. She said that she had no further questions for Advisor Kren and thanked him for his time. Kren returned to his seat. He moved carefully, the way a person moves when they are trying not to look like they want to sit down quickly. Screeth stood again. He said that the directive represented considered policy and that anecdotal examples did not constitute a systemic challenge. The Sorvan elder requested the floor. She was granted it. She stood slowly, the way she always stood, with the patience of something that had been standing and standing again for a very long time. She said that in her experience, 11 examples from a data set of 40 was not anecdotal. She said in her experience, 11 examples from a data set of 40 was a pattern. She said that she had been in this chamber for 30 years, and that she had a reliable sense of when a methodology was built to answer a question, and when it was built to avoid one. She said she did not think the directive was ready for a vote. She sat down. The session chair looked at Screeth. Screeth looked at the chamber. The chamber looked at Screeth with the collective neutral expression of 43 species that had just watched something happen and were waiting to see how he would respond. He withdrew the motion for a vote and requested a secondary review period. It was granted 7 days. As the session broke, Davo watched the upper tiers beginning to move and separate into small conversation clusters. He noticed that 3 of the delegations that had made the clicking sound 11 days ago were not talking to each other. They were talking to species on the other side of the room. He leaned toward Nora and said that something was shifting. Nora was straightening her documents into the case. She said that was what 11 examples did. She said it was not the data alone. Data could be argued. What could not be argued so easily was the image of a careful person reading 11 things calmly in a row while the person who had built the counterargument sat 20 feet away and could not interrupt any of it without looking worse. Davo said, so it was theater. Nora said, everything in a council chamber is theater. The question is always whose theater it is. She closed the case. Safi was at the door. They left. Behind them, the chamber buzzed with the sound of 43 species, trying to work out what had just happened to their afternoon. The 7 days did not go the way Screeth had planned. He had expected a quiet period, time for the counterdata to be absorbed, for informal conversations to settle the nervous delegations back into their positions, for the whole thing to re-solidify into the shape it had been in before the human ambassador started reading from a file at a floor table. He had managed council dynamics before. He understood momentum, how it built and how it slowed, and he had tools for both. What he had not planned for was the Yuvan document. It surfaced on the third day of the review period, submitted formally to the Covenant session record by Davo Pell on behalf of the human delegation. It was the 15-year-old support brief that Davo had found in the archive, the one with the Yuvan submission code, the one that had been logged and never discussed. It was entered into record with a single cover note that read, "Submitted for completeness of the historical record relating to humanity's Covenant membership application." No argument. No commentary. Just the document sitting in the official record where anyone could read it. By the end of that day, 7 delegations had pulled it from the archive. By the end of the second day, 12 had. The Yuvan brief was not a dramatic document. It did not use strong language. It presented its case methodically, the way something very old and very patient presents a case, with the assumption that the reader has time and intelligence and deserves both to be treated properly. It noted humanity's observed behaviors over the period of initial Covenant contact. It described specific incidents. A human team that had voluntarily rerouted their supply run to assist a stranded Kesran vessel, at cost to their own delivery schedule, without filing for compensation. A human researcher who had spent 4 months helping a Murine colleague rebuild a data set after a storage failure destroyed the original, again without formal compensation, simply because the work mattered. A human pilot who had navigated a debris field rescue in conditions that 3 other species pilots had declined as too risky, and who had filed a report afterward that contained detailed recommendations for improving debris field rescue protocols for everyone. It was a document made entirely of small things, things so small that no one had thought to put them together before. The brief's conclusion said that species were often evaluated on their largest moments, their wars and their achievements and their catastrophes. It said that humanity's largest moments were not necessarily its most revealing ones. It said that what it had observed over years of careful attention was a species whose instinct, even under pressure, was to fix things, not for recognition, simply because something was broken. It said that in its experience, that instinct was rarer than most species understood. Nora learned that the brief was circulating from Safi, who tracked document access patterns as a matter of professional habit. Safi reported the numbers without comment. Nora listened to them and was quiet for a moment. Then she asked Safi to find out if the Yuvan had an active communication address in the Covenant system. Safi said she would check. She came back an hour later and said there was an address but that it had not received a message from any Covenant member in 11 years. The last message sent to it had been an automated administrative notice about a filing deadline. Nora wrote a message to the address. It was short. It said thank you for the brief, that it had been very useful to finally read it, and that she would be glad of any further observations the Yuvan wished to share at their convenience and with no expectation of a response. She sent it and returned to her work and did not mention it again. On the 5th day, Screeth requested a private meeting with Nora. She agreed. They met in a small conference room on the station's administrative level, a place with a long table and too many chairs, and the slightly stale air of a room that was used for things people did not want to discuss in larger spaces. Screeth came alone. Nora brought Davo because she always brought Davo when she expected she might want a witness. Screeth sat. He arranged himself at the table with the deliberate care of someone who had prepared what they were going to say and was now making sure they were in the right position to say it. He said that the directive, as a piece of policy, had merit that was perhaps not being fully communicated by the current presentation. He said that a revised version, with certain sections reframed, might address some of the concerns that had been raised. Nora asked which sections. Screeth outlined them. The reframing involved softening the contribution differential language, adjusting the trade access restrictions to apply only to certain categories of goods, and removing the clause that had required quarterly behavioral reviews of human colony governance. Nora listened to all of it without expression. When he finished, she said that she appreciated him sharing the revisions. She said she would need to consider them. She said that before she did, she wanted to share something with him. She had not brought files. She spoke from memory. She said that over the past 3 weeks she had had conversations with 7 delegations in this chamber, not counting the Sorvon Elder or Counselor Veth. She said all 7 had raised, in different language, the same concern. The concern was not about the directive's economic logic. The concern was about what the directive represented. She said the word that had come up most often, across 7 conversations in 3 different languages, was the word signal. She said the directive, as written or as revised, sent a signal. The signal was that humanity's position in the Covenant was conditional in a way that other species' positions were not. She said that several delegations found this signal uncomfortable, not because of sentiment about humans specifically, but because a signal like that, once established in Covenant policy, could be pointed at other probationary species later. She said some of those delegations had their own complex histories with the concept of conditional membership. Screeth was very still. She said she was not threatening anything. She was telling him what she had heard because she thought it was information he should have. Then she said that what would actually resolve this was not a revised directive. What would resolve it was the Council formally acknowledging that Earth's probationary status was no longer justified by any metric currently in Covenant assessment standards, and moving to full membership review on that basis. Screeth said that was a significant change in scope from the current session agenda. Nora said, yes, most things worth doing are. He said he would need to consider it. She said that was fine. She said the session resumed in 2 days and that she would be ready either way. She and Davo left the room. In the corridor outside, Davo walked in silence for a while. Then he said that he had counted 3 moments in that meeting where Screeth had started to say something and stopped. Nora said she had counted 4. Davo asked what the 4th one was. Nora said it was right at the beginning, when he sat down, before he said anything at all. She said the way a person arranges themselves at a table before a difficult conversation tells you a great deal about whether they believe they are going to win it. She said Screeth had not arranged himself like someone who believed that. The morning the session was set to resume, a message arrived that nobody had expected. It came through the Covenant's external communication registry, which handled signals from non-member and associate status entities. The registry flagged it automatically because the sender identification was unusual, not unknown. The Yuvan were in the registry. They had been in it for longer than most of the current Covenant species had been spacefaring. But the Yuvan had not sent a message through that registry in 22 years, and the system's notification protocols were not well configured for an event it had not been designed to expect. Safi found it in the flagged queue at the start of her morning communication check. She read it twice, then she brought it to Nora. The message was addressed to the full Covenant Council session record, which meant it would be automatically entered as a formal submission visible to all delegations. It was not addressed to Nora personally, but its first line noted that it was submitted in response to Ambassador Vass's message of 3 days prior, which it quoted in full, so there was no ambiguity about what had prompted it. The Yuvan wrote that they did not often speak in Covenant proceedings. They said the reason for this was not indifference but a belief, developed over a very long time, that most proceedings resolved themselves correctly if the participants were given adequate information and adequate time. They said they had learned, also over a very long time, that this belief was not always correct, and that the gap between adequate information and the use of that information was sometimes too wide to close on its own. They said they were submitting the following for the record. What followed was 41 years of observations, not summarized, documented, specific incidents, dates, coordinates, species involved. A human crew that had maintained a Covenant navigation beacon for 6 years beyond its scheduled replacement date because the replacement team had been delayed and the beacon served 12 shipping routes that could not afford the gap. A human medical officer who had developed a field treatment for a Kesrin respiratory condition during a joint expedition, written it up in full, and submitted it to the Kesrin Medical Board, who had used it to update their standard protocols without acknowledgement. A human engineering team that had spent 8 months rerouting power infrastructure on a Dravathi station after a design failure, working alongside Dravathi engineers who had initially refused to accept help, and who had, by the end of the 8th month, asked the human team lead to review their next design before it was built. The Yuvan said they had 307 incidents in their records. They had submitted 41. They said they were prepared to submit the remainder if the council found them relevant. They said one more thing. They said that in their observation, the question before the council was not whether humanity was ready for full membership. The question was whether the council was ready to answer honestly for why it had taken this long to ask. The message ended there. Nora read it standing at the small table in the transit suite common area. Davo was beside her. Safi had stepped back to give them room. The suite was quiet. Through the narrow window the station's outer corridor was visible, and in the corridor the usual morning traffic of various species was moving in the direction of the administrative levels, unaware that anything had shifted. Davo said, very quietly, that he thought they might want to read that again. Nora said she was already on the second reading. When she finished, she set the data pad down. She said that the message would be in every delegation's queue by the time the session started. She said that the Sorvan Elder would have read it already because the Sorvan Elder read everything before anyone else did. She said that Counselor Veth would read it during the session opening formalities, and that whatever expression crossed her face when she did would be worth watching. She said that Screeth would read it, and that the question was what he would do with it. Davo said, "What can he do with it?" Nora said that was what made it interesting. She said when a private meeting produced bad news for one party, that party had options. They could dispute the facts, shift the framing, appeal to a different authority, delay. But when an ancient species with no stake in the outcome submitted a factual record to a public session document, the options narrowed considerably. You could not argue with the Yuvan. Not because they were powerful, they had no fleet, no trade leverage, no vote. But because arguing with a 300-year-old observation record in front of 43 species was the kind of thing that followed a delegation home. She picked up her coat. She said they should get to the chamber early. They arrived 20 minutes before the session opened. The chamber was already filling. Nora sat at the floor table and did not look at the upper tiers. She did not need to. She could hear the quality of the noise above her, and it was different from the first session, not the clicking sound, not amusement, but the dense and slightly urgent murmur of many species processing something at the same time. When the Sorvan Elder entered and took her seat, she looked directly at Nora across the chamber floor and held the look for 2 seconds. In Sorvan custom, this was a greeting between people who had reached the same conclusion by different paths. Nora acknowledged it with a slight nod. Screeth entered last. He sat. He arranged his materials. He looked at the session record display to his left where the Yuvan submission was visible at the top of the morning's new filings. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked away. The session chair opened proceedings and asked if any delegation wished to address new record submissions before the day's formal agenda. Counselor Veth raised her hand. She was recognized. She said that the Murine Collective, having reviewed the new submission alongside the existing session record, wished to formally propose an amendment to the current agenda. She said the Murine Collective proposed that the realignment directive be set aside, and that the Council open a formal full membership review for humanity under the standard assessment framework. The chamber absorbed this. The session chair asked if there was a second. 6 delegations raised their hands at the same moment. Davo was watching the upper tiers. He turned back to the table and said, barely above a whisper, that Screeth was not going to speak. Nora said, "I know." Davo said, "How do you know?" She said, "Because he stopped arranging his materials." A person who believed they were about to win an argument continued to prepare for it. A person who understood they had already lost went very still. Screeth was very still. The motion carried. The directive was set aside. The full membership review was opened. It was not the end. There were still procedures to follow, assessments to conduct, documents to file. It would take months. But the shape of it had changed in that chamber on that morning, in the space between a motion and 6 raised hands, and everyone present understood what that meant even if the formal record would take considerably longer to catch up. Nora gathered her materials as the session moved into procedural items. She did not look at Screeth. There was no reason to. Outside in the corridor afterward, with the station moving around them and the ordinary business of an ordinary day resuming in all directions, Davo asked her what came next. She said, "Now we do the work." He said, "Which part?" She said, "All of it, but that part we are good at." She was right, they were. The assessment took 4 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days. Nora was present for all of it. She had not gone back to Earth during the process, which was unusual. Most ambassadors cycled home during extended assessments, leaving the day-to-day work to their senior staff. Nora stayed because she had learned over 19 years that the work that happened in the corridors and the side rooms and the quiet conversations over bad food in the commercial level was often more important than the work that happened in formal sessions, and that the work in the corridors required someone who understood what they were actually trying to build. Davo had gone home once for 11 days to see his family. He came back with a changed posture, less cautious, more settled, as if the visit had reminded him of something he had needed reminding of. He never said what it was, and Nora did not ask. People carried what they carried, and that was their business. Safi had not left at all. She ran her relay checks every 3 days and ate her meals at the small table in the transit suite and read in the evenings, and seemed, as far as Nora could tell, completely unbothered by any of it, which was either a sign of very good mental discipline or a deeply placid personality. Nora had never been sure which. The assessment process involved 12 formal review sessions, 7 working group meetings, 2 site visits to human colonial installations, and 1 extended period during which the entire process stalled for 3 weeks because of a procedural dispute about the weighting methodology, the same issue that Advisor Kren had raised, now embedded in the assessment framework itself. Nora had addressed it in a written submission that was 11 pages long and had been drafted, redrafted, and redrafted again, until it said exactly what needed to be said in exactly the right way and not a word more. The procedural dispute was resolved in humanity's favor. Kren did not attend the resolution session. The Sorvan elder attended every session. She spoke rarely, and when she did it was always short and always decisive in the way that things are decisive when said by someone whose opinion carries accumulated weight. During the 3rd working group meeting, she had made a single observation about the site visit methodology that changed how the visits were structured and therefore changed what they found. And what they found had been considerably more favorable to Earth's application than the original methodology would have produced. She did not explain why she made the observation. She simply made it and let it work. Counselor Veth attended most of the formal sessions and all of the working groups. She had become, over the course of the 4 months, something that was not quite an ally and not quite a neutral party, something more precise than either. She operated in the space between positions, asking questions that opened doors without committing to walking through them herself. And Nora had come to understand that this was not caution but strategy, that Veth was building a position that would be defensible from multiple directions at once because she had learned, in a long career of Covenant politics, that the positions that survived were the ones that did not require any particular outcome. Nora respected that deeply. Screeth had submitted formal objections at 4 points in the process. Each objection was procedurally correct, and each one was addressed through the correct procedure. He did not attend the final review session. His deputy attended in his place, a younger Vhoran who asked no questions and signed nothing and left immediately afterward. The final session was not a ceremony. It was a vote. 38 in favor, 4 abstentions, 1 objection. The 1 objection came from a small delegation whose name Davo noted carefully and filed for future reference. The 4 abstentions were species that had been genuinely uncertain and had said so throughout the process, and Nora had more respect for their uncertainty than for any amount of easy agreement. When the chair announced the result, the chamber did not cheer. Covenant sessions did not cheer. What happened instead was a particular quality of sound, voices resuming at once after a moment of collective quiet that was in its own way louder than noise. Nora sat at the floor table and looked at the result on the session record display. It was 6 words and a date. She had been working toward those 6 words for 11 years. She did not feel what she had expected to feel. She had expected relief, or satisfaction, or something large and resolved. What she felt was more like the moment after a very long walk when you realize you have arrived and are not yet sure what to do with your feet. Davo said, "That's it." Nora said, "That's the beginning." He looked at her. She said that full membership meant full participation. It meant votes and committees and the actual work of being a Covenant member, which was not a ceremony but a daily operation. She said that Earth had spent 11 years proving it deserved a seat at the table. Now it had to do something with the seat. Davo said he thought that was going to be easier. Nora said she hoped he was right and thought he probably was, and was going to reserve final judgment for about 5 years out. After the session closed and the chamber emptied, the Sorvan elder crossed the floor for the first time. She was slow and deliberate about it, and the path she took was direct, which meant it was intentional. She stopped at the edge of the human delegation table and looked at Nora. She said, in her own language that the translator rendered in a flat, even tone, "I submitted a note to the procedural archive 14 years ago recommending that Earth's first membership application be given full review rather than expedited summary." Nora said she had not known that. The elder said, "It was rejected on administrative grounds." She paused. "I am glad the question came back around." She left the same way she had come. Nora stood at the table for a while after the chamber was empty. The blue light ran along the upper edges. The pale stone platform stood in the center of the floor. It was a room that had held 40 years of conversations, decisions, delays, and one session where a woman at a floor table had read 11 project examples aloud, while an entire chamber went quiet. She picked up her case. Safi was at the door. Davo was at the door. The transit suite would need to be vacated. There were reports to file, communications to send, a great deal of work to begin. She walked toward the door. Before she reached it, a message notification arrived on her personal pad. She glanced at it. It was from the Yuvan address. The message was 4 words. It said, "We will keep watching." Nora put the pad in her coat pocket. She said, to no one in particular and to the empty chamber behind her, "Good." Then she walked out into the corridor where the light was warmer, and the air smelled of the ordinary complicated life of a station full of species trying, imperfectly and persistently, to share a galaxy. It was, she thought, a reasonable place to start.